Across the American West, two very different forces of nature are at work, each a challenge in its own right, but together beginning to create a new kind of problem that few people have stopped to consider. On one hand, there are the volcanoes, the great chain of fire mountains that runs the length of the region, sleeping giants capable, over the long spans of geologic time, of powerful and far-reaching eruptions. On the other hand, there are the drying rivers, the shrinking flows, and steadily falling reservoirs that are stressing the water supply of tens of millions of people across the region as a prolonged drought and a warming climate tighten their relentless grip. For the most part, we tend to think of these as entirely separate concerns. The volcanic and the hydrological, each belonging to its own field of study and its own distinct set of worries. But they share the same ground, the same region, and increasingly the same systems. And when we consider how they might interact, a dangerous new problem comes into focus. A problem born not of either challenge alone, but of the dangerous way the two of them could someday compound and amplify each other. This is the story of that emerging problem, of how America's volcanoes and drying rivers are quietly coming together in ways that could make each of them considerably more dangerous than it would be alone. But before we begin, one honest and essential word. The volcanoes of the West are not erupting and show no sign of imminent eruption. They are watched closely and are not a present danger. The water crisis, by contrast, is entirely real and unfolding right now. What follows is a careful exploration of how these two great forces could interact, offered to illuminate the nature of risk and resilience, and not to stoke fear about events that are simply not coming. Quick honest word before we dive in. A lot of people watch these all the way through, love them, and forget the one small thing that keeps a channel like ours going, hitting subscribe. If you are finding this fascinating, take 1 second and subscribe right now. It genuinely matters for us and costs you nothing. And drop your state in the comments so we can see who is watching. Alright, let's begin. Two challenges sharing one region to understand the emerging problem. We first have to recognize that these two challenges, the volcanoes and the drying rivers, occupy the same ground, the same vast region of the American West, and that this overlap is what makes their interaction possible. The great volcanoes of the West run through the same broad region where the water crisis is unfolding. And in some cases, the very same mountains that are volcanoes are also the sources of the rivers, their snow and ice feeding the streams that flow down to the lowlands. The volcanic peaks of the Pacific Northwest, for example, are draped in glaciers and snow that feed the rivers of the region, so that the volcanic and the hydrological are bound together in the same mountains. The two challenges are not confined to separate corners of the country, but share the same landscape, the same watersheds, and the same communities. This shared ground is the foundation of the emerging problem, because it means that the two challenges are not truly independent, but can interact, each affecting the systems and the regions that the other touches. The water systems of the West, already stressed by the drying rivers, exist in the same region as the volcanoes, and a volcanic event could affect those water systems directly. The rivers that are drying are in some cases fed by the very volcanoes whose eruptions could disrupt them further, and the communities that depend on the water are, in some cases, the same communities that live in the shadow of the volcanoes. The overlap of the two challenges in the same region is what transforms them from separate concerns into a potentially compounding problem. And understanding this shared ground is the first step toward understanding how they could come together in dangerous ways. The volcanoes and the drying rivers are not distant strangers, but neighbors sharing the same land, and it is their proximity that gives rise to the new problem. When ash meets an already stressed water supply. The first and most direct way that the two challenges could compound is through the effect of volcanic ash on a water supply that is already stretched thin. And this is where the dangerous new problem becomes most concrete. When a volcano erupts, it can send ash across a wide area, and that ash, when it falls into water, can cause serious problems. Volcanic ash is not soft like the ash of a wood fire, but a fine, gritty powder of pulverized rock and glass, and it can contaminate reservoirs and other water sources, clouding the water, altering its chemistry, and making it harder to treat and to use. It can clog and damage the systems that treat and deliver water, from the intakes that draw water from reservoirs to the filters and equipment of the treatment plants. In a region whose water supply is already drying and stretched to its limits, this additional burden could be especially damaging because the system would have little slack to absorb it. A water system that is robust and full might handle the fall of ash without a crisis, treating the contaminated water and weathering the disruption. But a system already shrinking and stressed by the drying rivers would be far more vulnerable, its reservoirs already low and its treatment plants already straining to provide clean water from a diminished supply. The fall of ash into such a system could push it toward a genuine emergency, compounding the existing crisis and overwhelming a system that was already near its limits. This is the heart of the dangerous new problem, the way that a volcanic event and a drying water supply could interact, each making the other worse, so that a challenge a healthy system might absorb becomes a crisis for a system already stressed. The meeting of ash and an already stressed water supply is the clearest example of how the two challenges could compound. And it is the reason that the interaction of volcanoes and drying rivers is worth taking seriously. It is worth understanding that water treatment systems are, in fact, designed to remove impurities, and that in a healthy, well-resourced system, a modest amount of ash could likely be managed, filtered out along with the other material that treatment plants routinely remove every day. But a heavy fall of ash would overwhelm the normal capacity of the system, clogging the filters faster than they could be cleaned, and imposing a burden far beyond the ordinary. And crucially, a system already weakened by the drying rivers, already straining to provide clean water from a diminished source, would have far less capacity to take on this added challenge. The difference between a manageable nuisance and a genuine crisis would depend on the amount of ash and on the health of the system receiving it, and it is precisely because the Western water system is already stretched thin by the drying rivers that the added burden of ash could tip it from a manageable problem into a serious emergency. This is the crux of the interaction, the way that a stressed system transforms a challenge a healthy system could handle into a potential catastrophe, and it is why the convergence of the two challenges is so much more dangerous than either alone. Here is something I would genuinely love to know, and it takes 10 seconds. Had you ever thought about how a volcanic eruption could affect a water supply that is already shrinking? Drop a yes or no in the comments, because your reactions help us understand what surprises people most, and I read every reply. Okay, back to it. When drying rivers weaken the response, the interaction between the two challenges runs in both directions. Because just as a volcanic event could burden an already stressed water supply, so too could the drying rivers weaken the ability to respond to a volcanic event, and this is the second dimension of the dangerous new problem. Responding to a volcanic eruption, cleaning up the ash, managing the hazards, and sustaining the affected communities all require resources. And among the most important of those resources is water. Water is needed to clean up ash, to sustain the people affected, to support the emergency response, and to keep the systems of a region functioning through a crisis. And a region whose water is already drying and stretched thin would have less of this crucial resource to draw upon in responding to a volcanic event. This means that the drying rivers could weaken the resilience of a region in the face of a volcanic eruption, leaving it less able to cope with the disruption and to recover from it. A region with abundant water could draw on that water to respond to an eruption, but a region already struggling with a water shortage would find its response constrained by the scarcity of the very resource it needs. The drying rivers, in other words, do not only create their own crisis, but also undermine the ability to handle other crises, including a volcanic one, and this is a subtle but important dimension of the emerging problem. The two challenges weaken each other, the volcanic event burdening the stressed water supply and the water shortage weakening the response to the volcanic event, so that together they create a situation far more dangerous than either alone. This mutual weakening, this compounding of vulnerabilities, is the essence of the dangerous new problem, and it reveals why the interaction of the two challenges deserves attention, even as each remains, in its likelihood, very different from the other. Emergency planners think carefully about exactly these kinds of resource dependencies, because the ability to respond to any disaster depends on having the resources the response requires, and water is among the most fundamental of those resources. A region that has drawn down its water reserves to cope with a drought would find those reserves unavailable when another crisis struck. A hidden vulnerability that would only become apparent when the two challenges converged. This is why building resilience means not only preparing for each challenge separately, but ensuring that the resources needed to respond are not already exhausted by another crisis, and it is a principle that applies far beyond volcanoes and water. To any situation where the response to one challenge depends on resources that another challenge has depleted. The mountains where fire and water meet there is a particular place where the two challenges come together most intimately, and that is on the volcanic mountains themselves, whose ice and snow feed the rivers even as the mountains carry the potential for volcanic hazards. And this intersection reveals another dimension of the emerging problem. Many of the great volcanoes of the West are draped in glaciers and snow, and this ice is not only a feature of the mountains, but a source of the rivers, feeding the streams that flow down to the lowlands and sustain the communities and farms below. The volcanic mountains are thus, in a very real sense, water towers as well as fire mountains, storing water in their ice and releasing it to the rivers, so that the volcanic and the hydrological are united in the same peaks. This union creates its own dangers and complexities. As the climate warms, the glaciers and snow on these mountains are shrinking, which affects the rivers they feed, contributing to the drying of the streams and the water crisis below. At the same time, the ice on these mountains is a factor in their volcanic hazards, because it is the interaction of volcanic heat with ice and snow that can produce the destructive mudflows called lahars, so that the very ice that feeds the rivers is also bound up with the volcanic danger. The mountains where fire and water meet are thus places of particular complexity, where the shrinking of the ice affects both the rivers and the volcanic hazards, and where the two challenges are woven together in the same landscape. Understanding this intersection helps to reveal how deeply the volcanic and the hydrological are connected in the West, not as separate concerns, but as intertwined aspects of the same mountains and the same changing environment. And it adds another layer to the dangerous new problem that their interaction creates. There is a further irony in this connection, because the shrinking of the ice on the volcanic mountains, driven by the same warming that is drying the rivers, changes the nature of the volcanic hazards themselves. Less ice means, in some respects, a different balance of hazards. And the interaction between a warming climate, shrinking glaciers, and volcanic activity is an area that scientists continue to study, precisely because the changes to the ice affect both the water supply and the volcanic risks. The mountains where fire and water meet are thus at the very center of the convergence, places where the warming climate, the drying rivers, and the volcanic hazards all come together in a single landscape, and where the connections between the challenges are most visible. To watch these mountains is to watch the meeting point of the two great forces, and to understand how thoroughly they are intertwined in the changing environment of the West. Quick pause, because this matters and deserves to be seen. If you are finding this fascinating, tap the like button. It really does help the video reach more people. And if you have family or friends who care about science or the future of the West, share this with them, because it is genuinely thought-provoking. One like, one share to someone you care about, and let's keep going. The ripple effects across a region beyond the direct interaction of ash and water and the weakening of the response, the convergence of the two challenges would send ripple effects across the many systems of a region, compounding the difficulty in ways that reach into every dimension of life. Consider agriculture, for example, which depends both on water and on the health of the land, and which would be doubly threatened by a scenario in which volcanic ash fell on farmland already struggling with a drying water supply. The ash could damage crops and coat the fields, while the diminished water would make irrigation harder, so that the food supply that depends on the region's water and land could be significantly disrupted, struck from two directions at once. Consider, too, the systems of power and infrastructure that are bound up with water. The great dams of the West generate electricity as well as storing water, and a system already stressed by low reservoirs and threatened by volcanic ash could face challenges to its power generation as well as its water supply, with the two crises compounding to strain the energy systems of the region. The transportation networks, the treatment facilities, and the countless systems that depend on water and that would be affected by ash would all be strained by the combined crisis, and the effects would ripple outward through the interconnected systems of the region. This is the nature of compounding crises, that they do not simply add together, but interact and multiply, each making the other worse, and their combined effect reaching into many systems at once. The convergence of the volcanoes and the drying rivers would thus be felt not in one place or one system, but across the whole fabric of a region, a reminder of how interconnected the systems of modern life truly are, and of how a challenge in one can become a challenge in many when the stresses combine. The deeper problem of compounding crises. Stepping back from the specific ways that volcanoes and drying rivers interact, we can see that they are an example of a deeper and more general problem, the problem of compounding crises, and understanding this general principle helps to reveal why the interaction of the two challenges is so significant. A compounding crisis occurs when two or more challenges come together and amplify each other, so that their combined effect is greater than the sum of their parts, each making the other worse, and the whole becoming more dangerous than either alone. This is precisely what the interaction of volcanoes and drying rivers represents, a compounding of a volcanic hazard and a water crisis, each amplifying the other, and it is a pattern that appears throughout the study of risk and resilience. The danger of compounding crises is that they can overwhelm systems that might have handled either challenge alone, because a system stressed by one crisis has less capacity to absorb another, and the two together can push it past its limits. A water system that could weather a volcanic ash fall when healthy might fail when already stressed by drought. And a region that could respond to an eruption when its water was abundant might struggle when its rivers are drying. The compounding of the two challenges creates a situation in which the vulnerabilities multiply, and the whole becomes far more dangerous than the parts. This is the deeper problem that the interaction of America's volcanoes and drying rivers reveals. The danger of compounding crises, and it is a problem that reaches far beyond these two particular challenges, applying to any situation where multiple stresses converge on the same systems. Recognizing this pattern is essential to understanding the emerging problem, because it reveals that the danger lies not in either challenge alone, but in their potential to combine. And that the resilience of our systems, their capacity to absorb multiple shocks, is what will determine whether they can withstand a future of compounding crises. Building resilience against the convergence faced with the dangerous new problem of compounding crises, the response is not despair, but the deliberate building of resilience. The strengthening of our systems so that they can withstand the convergence of multiple challenges, and this is where the emerging problem points toward a constructive path forward. The most important step is to address the water crisis itself, quite apart from any volcano, because a more resilient water supply, with reserves and flexibility, and a balance between demand and supply, would be better able to withstand not only the ordinary pressures of drought, but the added shock of a volcanic event or any other crisis. Building a water system that is not perpetually stretched to its limits is the single most valuable thing that could be done to guard against the compounding of the two challenges, because it would give the system the slack it needs to absorb an additional shock. Beyond strengthening the water supply, building resilience against the convergence involves preparing for the interaction of multiple hazards, planning for the possibility that challenges could come together, and ensuring that the systems and the communities of the region are ready to cope with compounding crises. This means monitoring the volcanoes and the water systems alike, developing plans that account for the interaction of hazards, and building the reserves and the flexibility that allow a region to weather multiple shocks. It means recognizing that the challenges of the West are connected, that the volcanic and the hydrological are woven together, and that a resilient region must prepare for both. The dangerous new problem of compounding crises is a call to build this resilience, to strengthen the systems we depend on so that they can withstand whatever the future may bring, whether the slow pressure of drought, the rare shock of an eruption, or the dangerous convergence of the two. In building resilience against the convergence, we prepare ourselves not only for these particular challenges, but for the broader reality of a world in which multiple stresses increasingly come together, and this is the constructive response that the emerging problem calls for. Alright, I know, second time I am bringing this up, feel free to sigh at me. But quickly, if you have made it this deep into a video about America's volcanoes and rivers, you clearly find this stuff fascinating, and a lot of you who watch have not subscribed yet. That one tap genuinely tips the scales for a small channel like ours. No guilt, just a grateful ask. That is the last time. Promise. Let's finish. Keeping the two challenges in perspective as we bring this exploration to a close, it is essential to keep the two challenges in their proper perspective because they are very different in their likelihood and their nature, and understanding this difference is key to responding wisely. The risk of a major volcanic eruption in the West is real over the long spans of geologic time, but it is not a present danger, not something expected in any foreseeable time frame, and the volcanoes are watched with the greatest care so that any genuine change would be detected long in advance. To dwell on the fear of an eruption would be to misunderstand the science, which tells us clearly that such an event is not on the horizon. The volcanic side of the emerging problem is a rare and remote possibility, a scenario to be understood rather than feared. The water crisis, by contrast, is real, present, and unfolding now, a challenge that is already reshaping the West and that demands attention and action. It is the drying rivers, far more than the volcanoes, that represent the immediate and pressing danger, and the great value of considering their interaction is that it draws attention to the reality of the water crisis and to the importance of building resilience against it. The dangerous new problem of compounding crises is best understood not as a prophecy of a volcanic and hydrological catastrophe, which is not what the science predicts, but as a lens that reveals the fragility of a water system stretched to its limits and the value of strengthening it. The wisest response is to focus our energy where it truly matters, on the real and present challenge of securing our water, and in doing so to build the resilience that would protect us not only against the ordinary pressures of drought, but against whatever rarer shocks the future might hold. America's volcanoes will almost certainly sleep on, as they have for so long, while the water crisis continues to unfold. And the emerging problem of their potential convergence is, in the end, a reminder that the resilience of our essential systems is worth building now, so that whatever the future brings, the systems we depend on will be strong enough to endure. The volcanoes and the drying rivers, sharing the same land, remind us that the challenges of our world are connected, and that meeting them wisely requires understanding those connections and preparing for the ways they may combine. In the end, the true value of contemplating this dangerous new problem is not the fear it might inspire, but the wisdom it can teach. The understanding that our systems must be built to withstand not just single challenges, but the convergence of many. And that the work of strengthening our water supply against the present crisis is also the work of preparing for whatever the future may hold. That is the quiet lesson hidden inside a question about fire mountains and vanishing rivers,